welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. I stared at the display screen for the third time, certain my eyes were deceiving me. The numbers glowed amber against the dark control panel. Core pressure climbing past 2,100 psi and rising steadily. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago, forgotten beside the stack of maintenance reports I'd been reviewing during what should have been a routine night shift. The reactor had been running smoothly for 18 months since the last scheduled maintenance. These readings violated every operational parameter I knew. I keyed my radio with steady fingers, years of training suppressing the tremor in my voice. Control room to reactor bay. Kalen, are you down there? Static crackled back at me. Yeah, Idris. Just finished checking the secondary cooling circulation. All flow indicators show green from here. Green from here didn't mean green from the control room. I wiped perspiration from my forehead despite the control room's constant 68-degree temperature. The pressure gauge hadn't moved backward once in the last 12 minutes. Only forward, creeping toward the yellow warning zone at 2,400 psi. Kalen, I need visual confirmation on containment hatch 17. The pressure sensors are showing readings outside normal operational range. Copy that. Give me 5 minutes to access the primary inspection corridor. I switched channels. Idris to shift supervisor Leora. We have developing anomalous readings in Reactor Bay 1 that require immediate assessment. On my way to control, came her immediate response. No questions, no hesitation. That's what I respected about Leora. 15 years in nuclear operations had taught her to treat every anomaly as potentially critical until proven otherwise. While waiting, I accessed the facility's automated diagnostic systems. Status indicators showed green across all primary systems with one notable exception. Backup cooling system Alpha displayed a yellow caution status. Not critical red, but concerning enough to make my stomach tighten. I scrolled through the system logs, searching for maintenance alerts or unusual operator notes from the previous shifts. The logs were clean. Too clean. 72 hours of operation with 0 irregularities. 0 maintenance notes. 0 operator comments. In my 8 years at this facility, I'd never seen logs this sterile. The control room door hissed open and Leora entered, still adjusting her supervisor's badge on her uniform jacket. Her dark eyes immediately found the pressure display. How long has it been climbing? First noticed it 47 minutes ago. Started at 1,950. Now we're at 2,160 and climbing at roughly 4 psi per minute. She moved to the backup monitoring station, fingers dancing across the interface with practiced efficiency. Primary cooling system operational. Flow rates normal. Temperature differential within parameters. Secondary. Kalen's doing visual inspection now, but remote sensors show normal operation. Leora frowned, pulling up additional system displays. Emergency cooling? I hesitated. This was where things got complicated. Backup cooling Alpha shows a caution status. Not offline, but questionable. Define questionable. Before I could respond, Kalen's voice crackled through the radio, his usual calm professionalism cracking around the edges. Control room, this is Kalen. You need to see this immediately. Report status. Leora commanded. Containment hatch 17 is exhibiting visible structural deformation. I can observe stress fractures radiating outward from the primary seal assembly, and the metal surrounding the locking mechanism shows definite thermal distortion patterns. The surface temperature feels elevated even through my gloves. The coffee mug slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the control room floor. Containment hatch 17 provided direct access to the reactor's pressure vessel chamber. Visible warping meant internal conditions had exceeded every safety parameter we monitored. Kalen, get clear of that area immediately and report to control room, Leora ordered. Full protective gear. I was already accessing emergency protocols on my secondary monitor, years of drill training overriding the rising panic. But this wasn't a quarterly safety exercise. The metallic taste filling my mouth wasn't from the stale break room coffee. It was the first biological warning of radiation exposure. Leora, I said, keeping my voice level while indicating my personal dosimeter. The digital display read 0.08 millirems per hour, elevated above background levels. We're detecting radiation scatter at control room level. Her expression hardened into the mask of command I'd seen during emergency drills. She activated the facility-wide communication system. Attention all personnel. This is Shift Supervisor Leora. We are implementing Condition Yellow safety protocols effective immediately. All non-essential personnel evacuate to the upper-level emergency staging area. This is not a drill. The emergency klaxon began its distinctive three-tone sequence, echoing through every corridor and chamber in the facility. I knew that throughout the building, automated systems were sealing containment doors, switching ventilation to emergency filtration mode, and activating backup lighting systems. I checked the pressure reading, 2,195 psi and climbing at an accelerating rate. Mounted on the wall behind Leora's workstation was a framed photograph from the facility's dedication ceremony 5 years ago. The image showed our entire staff gathered in front of the newly completed reactor building, proud faces reflecting confidence in clean nuclear energy. The state governor stood beside representatives from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and our parent utility company. In the front row, local elementary school children held a hand-painted banner reading, "Safe Energy for Our Future." Those children lived in Millbrook Township, 3 miles northeast along the prevailing wind patterns. Population, 8,400 residents. My dosimeter clicked once, a soft sound that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet control room. Then twice. The clicks began establishing a slow but unmistakably steady rhythm. Across the room, Leora's device produced the same ominous percussion. "How much time do we have?" she asked, her supervisor's training demanding concrete assessments even as fear crept into her voice. I calculated rapidly, factoring pressure increase rates, containment structural limits, and backup cooling system capacity. If pressure continues climbing at current acceleration and backup cooling alpha fails, I forced myself to complete the analysis. For hours maximum before we reach critical containment failure threshold. The control room door opened and Kalen entered, his face showing the flush of exertion and barely controlled anxiety. He'd removed his inspection gear, but I could see his hands trembling as he approached our monitoring station. "The situation down there is beyond anything we've trained for," he said without preamble. "The radiation levels near Hatch 17 are fluctuating wildly. During one surge, my dosimeter peaked at 2.4 millirems per hour." Leora and I locked eyes. That level of radiation scatter suggested reactor core conditions far exceeding what our remote monitoring systems indicated, assuming our instruments were functioning correctly. "There's more," Kalen continued, lowering his voice as if speaking the words too loudly might make them more real. I attempted to manually activate the emergency backup cooling systems as a precautionary measure. The manual override controls are completely unresponsive. The system acknowledges my authorization codes, but refuses to execute any commands. The first sharp spike of genuine fear pierced through my professional composure. Without manual override capability, we were completely dependent on automated systems that were clearly malfunctioning or compromised. The pressure reading now displayed 2,230 psi and climbing. "I need to contact the Nuclear Regulatory Commission emergency line," Leora said, reaching for the secure red telephone that provided direct communication to federal authorities. She lifted the handset, input the memorized emergency code, and waited. After 45 seconds, she disconnected and tried again. "No connection," she reported tersely. I tested the standard facility telephone line. No dial tone. Our internet connection showed complete network failure. Even our personal cellular devices displayed no service, despite the facility's installed signal boosters that normally provided excellent coverage. We were completely isolated from outside communication. This represents a coordinated failure pattern, I said, articulating what we all understood but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Simultaneous equipment malfunctions, communication blackouts, backup system failures. Someone planned for us to be isolated when this crisis began. Kalen's complexion drained to an unhealthy pale gray. Idris, Leora, there's something I need to tell you both. Something about the scheduled maintenance that was postponed last month. Before he could continue, every alarm system in the control room activated simultaneously. The main display flashed urgent red as the pressure reading jumped to 2,360 psi, deep into the danger zone where containment integrity became questionable. I looked once more at the dedication ceremony photograph on the wall, focusing on those smiling children with their optimistic banner, and felt the crushing weight of 8,400 civilian lives settling across my shoulders. My dosimeter's clicking rhythm accelerated into a rapid, staccato beat. The pressure alarm's shriek cut through our conversation like a blade. I watched the display climb past 2,340 psi, officially entering the red zone for the first time in this facility's operational history, continuing its relentless climb from where we'd left off. My hands moved automatically to emergency procedures, muscle memory overriding the growing dread in my chest. All personnel to upper levels immediately, Leora commanded through the facility-wide system. Implement radiation exposure protocols. Move to emergency staging area and await further instructions. I activated the automated emergency systems, watching status indicators shift from green to amber across multiple panels. The facility's computer systems began isolating contaminated areas, sealing blast doors, and switching to emergency power mode. But one critical system remained stubbornly red: primary cooling circulation alpha. Kalen, that maintenance issue you mentioned, I need details now, I said, never taking my eyes off the climbing pressure readings. He wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak across the grime accumulated during his inspection. The primary cooling pump bearings were showing stress indicators 3 weeks ago. Management approved delaying replacement until the next scheduled shutdown to avoid production losses. My stomach dropped. Those bearings were critical components. Their failure would compromise coolant flow to the reactor core, causing exactly the kind of pressure buildup we were experiencing. How bad were the stress indicators? Leora demanded. Vibration analysis showed where patterns consistent with bearing deterioration. The technical recommendation was immediate replacement, but he trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. But profit margins don't allow for unscheduled shutdowns, I completed grimly. I'd seen this pattern before at other facilities. Deferred maintenance justified by statistical risk assessment until statistics became reality. A new alarm joined the cacophony. Secondary cooling system failure. I watched in horrified fascination as the system status shifted from green to amber to red in 30 seconds. The temperature differential between coolant input and output began climbing rapidly. We just lost secondary cooling, I reported, my voice steadier than I felt. Primary cooling is struggling to handle the full thermal load. Leora activated her radio. All facility personnel, this is shift supervisor. We have escalated to condition orange. Anyone not directly involved in emergency operations must evacuate the building immediately. Contact the Township Emergency Coordinator and initiate evacuation procedures for residents within the 3-mile radius. Static answered her. She tried again. Still nothing. Our radio transmission isn't reaching beyond the facility, she said, her command mask slipping to reveal genuine fear. The towers must be experiencing interference or deliberate jamming. I accessed the facility's external monitoring systems, hoping to understand the scope of our isolation. The township's emergency broadcast network showed offline. The state police communication relay registered no signal. Even the weather service data feeds had gone dark. Someone wanted us completely cut off when this started, I said, voicing what we all understood. This isn't mechanical failure. It's coordinated sabotage. Kalen moved to the auxiliary monitoring station, checking radiation levels throughout the facility. His dosimeter was clicking more rapidly now, and I noticed mine keeping the same accelerating rhythm. The control room's background radiation had climbed to 0.15 millirems per hour, not immediately dangerous, but significantly elevated. Radiation scatter is increasing throughout the upper levels, he reported. Whatever's happening in the reactor chamber is affecting containment integrity. Through the control room's reinforced windows, I could see other facility personnel moving through the corridors with practiced emergency evacuation procedures. But their movements seemed too slow, too casual. They didn't understand the true severity of what we faced. The quarterly drills had prepared them for minor incidents, equipment malfunctions, routine precautionary measures. Not this. Pressure is now 2,385 psi and climbing at 6 psi per minute, I announced. The acceleration was terrifying. At this rate, we had less than 4 hours before reaching structural failure threshold, assuming the compromised cooling systems could maintain even minimal functionality. Leora attempted manual override of the emergency cooling systems from her supervisor station. The computer acknowledged her authorization codes, displayed the command sequence, then returned an error message. Manual override not available, system lockout active. The emergency systems are locked out, she said, staring at the display in disbelief. Someone has administrative control over our safety equipment. I felt the first edge of panic creeping into my thoughts. Every nuclear facility had multiple backup systems specifically designed to prevent scenarios like this. Deliberate sabotage of safety equipment violated every international protocol for nuclear security. My dosimeter clicked again, a sharp sound that seemed to echo off the control room walls. Then Leora's, then Kalen's. We were all experiencing increasing radiation exposure. Kalen, I need you to attempt manual activation of the emergency cooling from the basement level, I instructed. The hardwired controls down there should bypass computer lockouts. His face paled. The basement level? Idris, that's directly adjacent to the reactor chamber. Radiation exposure down there will be lethal within minutes, I finished. But if we can't get emergency cooling online, radiation exposure becomes irrelevant because we'll all be dead anyway. Through the facility's internal monitoring system, I watched personnel evacuating through the main entrance. They moved efficiently but without urgency, following standard protocols for routine emergencies. None of them understood that they might be walking into a radiation zone if containment failed catastrophically. How many people are still in the building? Leora asked. I checked the personnel tracking system. 43 staff members plus 5 security guards, plus the 3 of us. Most are heading to evacuation staging areas, but some are still in lower levels completing shutdown procedures. Get them out, she ordered. All of them. Whatever's happening here is beyond standard emergency protocols. I activated the facility-wide communication system. Attention all personnel. This is Nuclear Engineer Idris speaking from Control Room. We have experienced catastrophic failure of primary cooling systems with escalating radiation exposure throughout the facility. All personnel must evacuate immediately to the parking area beyond the security perimeter. Do not attempt to secure equipment or complete routine shutdown procedures. Leave the building now. The urgency in my voice carried across every speaker in the facility. Through the windows, I could see personnel movements shift from orderly evacuation to genuinely urgent flight. People were running now, abandoning their assigned duties to reach safety. But as I watched the evacuation, a horrifying realization struck me. The main access road leading away from the facility passed directly through Millbrook Township. If those personnel were carrying radiation contamination on their clothing or in their lungs, they could spread contaminated particles throughout the residential area before anyone realized the danger. Leora, we need to establish a decontamination checkpoint before anyone leaves the facility perimeter, I said. If they're carrying radioactive particles. She nodded grimly. But we can't establish proper decontamination without external support, and we can't contact external support. Kalen had been monitoring the reactor chamber status while we coordinated evacuation. His face showed the pallor of someone receiving very bad news. Idris, look at this, he said, indicating his monitoring display. Core temperature is climbing despite partial cooling system operation. We're starting to see signs of fuel rod degradation. I studied the telemetry data with growing horror. The reactor's uranium fuel assemblies were designed to operate within specific temperature ranges. Beyond those ranges, the fuel rods themselves began breaking down, releasing fission products that would contaminate the cooling system and eventually breach containment. How long before fuel rod failure? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. At current temperature climb rate, maybe 90 minutes before we start seeing significant fuel degradation. 3 hours before catastrophic failure. The timeline had just accelerated dramatically. We weren't dealing with a pressure release valve failure or cooling system malfunction anymore. We were facing the initial stages of reactor meltdown. My dosimeter's clicking had established a steady rhythm now, like a metronome marking time until disaster. I looked at the readings, 0.22 millirems per hour and climbing. Still within survivable limits, but the upward trend was unmistakable. We need to get down to the manual controls, I said, making the decision that terrified me most. Computer systems have been compromised, but the hardwired emergency controls might still function. That's a suicide mission, Kalen said bluntly. Radiation levels near the reactor chamber will cook anyone who stays down there longer than 5 minutes. Then we have 5 minutes to save 8,400 people, I replied. Through the control room windows, I could see the last facility personnel reaching the parking area beyond the security fence. They gathered in confused clusters, looking back at the building they'd just abandoned, waiting for instructions that might never come. Leora checked her dosimeter again. 0.25 millirems per hour. Radiation is still climbing up here in the supposedly safe control room. I accessed the facility's engineering blueprints on my terminal, studying the layout of manual control systems in the basement level. There were 3 separate emergency cooling activation points, each requiring different authorization procedures. If computer lockouts had disabled remote activation, manual override might still be possible. But the basement level was less than 50 feet from the reactor chamber. Anyone attempting manual activation would be working in a high radiation environment with limited time before lethal exposure. I'll go, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I know the manual systems better than anyone else here. No, Leora said immediately. I'm facility supervisor. If someone needs to take this risk, it's my responsibility. With respect, Leora, you're needed up here to coordinate evacuation and communicate with external authorities if we reestablish contact. I'm the nuclear engineer. Manual system activation is my specific expertise. Kalen moved to the equipment locker, removing radiation protection gear. You're both wrong. I'm the one with intimate knowledge of recent maintenance issues. I know exactly which systems have been compromised and which might still function properly. The pressure alarm reached a new pitch as readings climbed past 2,400 psi. We were now in uncharted territory, pressure levels this facility had never been designed to withstand. I made the hardest decision of my professional career. Kalen goes to the basement for manual activation. Leora coordinates evacuation and attempts to reestablish outside communication. I stay here to monitor reactor status and maintain communication between all parties. If Kalen doesn't succeed, Leora began. Then we implement the final protocol, I said quietly. She knew what I meant. Every nuclear facility had ultimate emergency procedures that were never discussed in routine training, never practiced in quarterly drills. Procedures designed for scenarios where containment failure threatened massive civilian casualties. My dosimeter clicked twice in quick succession. The radiation was climbing faster now. Kalen, You have maybe 10 minutes maximum exposure time before accumulating dangerous levels. I warned. Get down there, activate whatever systems will respond, and get back up here immediately. He nodded grimly, adjusting the radiation monitoring equipment clipped to his protective suit. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, you'll be back, Leora said with forced confidence. As Kalen left the control room, I turned back to the pressure readings. 2,420 psi and climbing at 8 psi per minute. The acceleration was getting worse. Through the reinforced windows, I could see the evacuated personnel in the parking area, small figures against the night sky. They stood in organized groups, following emergency procedures, waiting for the all-clear signal that I wasn't sure would ever come. My dosimeter clicked again, keeping time with approaching disaster. The 15 minutes stretched into eternity. I watched the basement-level monitors, tracking Kalen's progress through the facility's lower sections. His radiation dosimeter signal appeared as a moving dot on my display, showing exposure levels climbing rapidly as he approached the manual control stations. Current exposure rate in basement, 2.7 millirems per hour. I announced to Leora, my voice tight with worry. That's manageable for short-term exposure, but it's climbing. Leora worked frantically at the communications console, cycling through emergency frequencies, trying to reach anyone beyond our facility's perimeter. Static answered every attempt. Still nothing on external communications. Whatever's blocking our signals is comprehensive. Through my headset, I heard Kalen's voice, distorted by static from the high radiation environment. Reached Manual Control Station Alpha. Attempting emergency cooling activation. I watched his biometric readings on my screen, heart rate elevated but stable, radiation exposure accumulating but not yet dangerous. The manual activation procedure required 3 separate authorization sequences, each taking approximately 2 minutes to complete. Authorization sequence 1 complete, Kalen reported. Moving to station beta. The pressure readings continued their relentless climb, 2,445 psi and accelerating. I ran quick calculations in my head. At the current rate of increase, we had perhaps 2 hours before containment structural failure, less if the climbing rate continued to accelerate. Then my terminal displayed something that made my blood freeze. Hidden in the system logs, buried beneath routine operational data, I found a series of remote access entries from 3 weeks ago. Someone with high-level administrative credentials had accessed our safety systems and implemented subtle modifications to emergency protocols. Leora, look at this. I called her over to my station. Someone has been in our systems for weeks, making changes to safety protocols. She studied the log entries, her face growing pale. These modification timestamps match exactly with when the maintenance delays were approved. The same person who delayed the bearing replacement also compromised our emergency systems. I traced the digital trail deeper into the system logs. The modifications were sophisticated, designed to create failure cascades that would overwhelm our safety systems during emergency conditions. Someone with intimate knowledge of nuclear facility operations had deliberately engineered this disaster. This wasn't random sabotage, I realized aloud. This was specifically targeted to create maximum containment failure with minimal early warning. Kalen's voice crackled through the static. Station beta authorization complete. Radiation exposure at 4.1 millirems per hour down here. Moving to final station, I checked his accumulated exposure levels. Still within survivable limits, but climbing toward the threshold where immediate medical intervention would be required. Then Leora made a discovery that changed everything. Idris, these access logs show the saboteur used legitimate administrative credentials, she said, pointing to the authentication data. Someone with authorized access to our systems did this. Someone who works here. The implications hit me like a physical blow. One of our own colleagues had deliberately engineered this disaster. Someone we trusted, someone we worked alongside daily, had spent weeks setting up a scenario designed to kill thousands of people. Who had access to these administrative credentials? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Leora pulled up the facility's access control database. Only 5 people have the necessary clearance level: myself, the facility director, the chief engineer, the security supervisor, and... She paused, staring at the screen in shock. And the lead maintenance supervisor, I finished. We both understood the horrible logic immediately. The maintenance supervisor would have intimate knowledge of our system's vulnerabilities, authorized access to safety protocols, and the administrative credentials needed to implement subtle sabotage. The delayed bearing replacement hadn't been a cost-saving measure. It had been the trigger for a deliberately engineered disaster. Kalen's final authorization sequence in progress, I reported, monitoring his location. But Leora, if the maintenance supervisor engineered this crisis, then Kalen might be walking into... My terminal erupted with new alarms. The manual control stations that Kalen was attempting to activate were registering system conflicts. Instead of initiating emergency cooling, his authorization sequences were triggering lockout protocols. Kalen, abort the manual activation immediately, I shouted into my headset. The manual systems have been compromised too. His response was broken by static. Can't abort, system won't accept. Authorization required. The implications were terrifying. The saboteur had anticipated that facility personnel would attempt manual override during an emergency. The manual control stations had been modified to trap anyone who tried to use them, forcing them to remain in high radiation areas while completing authorization sequences that would never actually function. He's trapped down there, I said, watching Kalen's radiation exposure climb past 6 millirems per hour. The manual systems are designed to keep him in the basement until he receives lethal exposure. Leora grabbed the facility directory, scanning for the maintenance supervisor's contact information. Where is he? If he's responsible for this, we need to find him immediately. I accessed the facility's personnel tracking system, searching for the maintenance supervisor's current location. The system showed his ID badge as having left the building 47 minutes ago, exactly when the emergency alerts began. He evacuated immediately when the crisis started, I reported. He knew exactly what was going to happen because he planned it. Kalen's voice came through clearly for a moment. Authorization sequences aren't working. Systems are locked in some kind of loop. Radiation exposure getting dangerous down here. I made a desperate decision. Kalen, forget the manual systems. Look for the emergency mechanical release valves. They're purely mechanical. No computer control. No authorization sequences required. Where? He asked. I pulled up the facility's mechanical engineering schematics. Northeast corner of the basement level. Red wheel valves marked emergency coolant release. They'll flood the reactor chamber with emergency coolant, but you'll need to open all 3 valves simultaneously. That's going to require at least 10 minutes of work in the highest radiation zone, Kalen replied grimly. I checked his current exposure levels. 7.2 millirems per hour and climbing. 10 more minutes of exposure at these levels would put him at the threshold of radiation sickness, possibly lethal if he didn't receive immediate medical treatment. Kalen, if you do this, you're going to need emergency medical evacuation afterward. I told him honestly, this level of radiation exposure is going to make you very sick. How sick? He asked. Severe radiation poisoning, possible organ failure, maybe fatal without immediate hospital treatment. There was silence on the communications channel for several seconds. Then Kalen's voice returned, steady and resolved. How many people live in the contamination zone if this reactor melts down? I consulted the emergency planning maps. Within immediate fallout range, approximately 8,400 residents. Broader contamination could affect up to 50,000 people over the next several months. Then I'm opening those valves. Leora moved to my station, watching Kalen's progress on the basement level monitors. There has to be another way. Some method that doesn't require lethal radiation exposure. I studied every system schematic, every emergency protocol, every backup procedure in our entire operational manual. The saboteur had been thorough. Computer-controlled systems were locked out. Manual control stations were compromised. The only remaining option was the purely mechanical emergency valves, and they were located in the most dangerous part of the facility. "There is no other way," I said quietly. The saboteur planned for every contingency except someone being willing to sacrifice themselves to operate the mechanical systems. Through my headset, I could hear Kalen moving through the basement level. His breathing was labored now, and I knew he was feeling the first effects of significant radiation exposure: nausea, fatigue, disorientation. "Located the first valve," he reported. "Beginning manual operation." On my display, his radiation exposure climbed past 9 millirems per hour. The mechanical valves would require significant physical effort to operate, extending his time in the lethal environment. "Pressure now at 2,467 psi, I announced. "Rate of increase is accelerating. We're running out of time even if Kalen succeeds." Leora attempted once more to contact external authorities, cycling through every emergency frequency. This time, she received a brief response, garbled and distant, but definitely human voices. "This is facility control to any emergency authority," she transmitted. "We have a nuclear emergency in progress with reactor containment failure imminent. Need immediate emergency response and medical evacuation capabilities." The response was broken by static. "Emergency services are responding. Multiple facilities, coordinated attack, cannot provide immediate." The transmission cut off, leaving us with horrible understanding. This wasn't an isolated incident. Other nuclear facilities were experiencing similar crises simultaneously. The sabotage was part of a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm emergency response capabilities. "First valve is open," Kalen reported. "Moving to valve 2. Radiation exposure is making me dizzy." I checked his biometric readings with growing alarm. Heart rate irregular, temperature elevated, radiation exposure at 11.3 millirems per hour. He was developing acute radiation syndrome in real time. "Kalen, you need to hurry," I urged. "Your body can't sustain this exposure much longer." As he worked on the second valve, I made a terrible discovery in the facility's maintenance records. The emergency mechanical valves that Kalen was struggling to operate had been scheduled for replacement 3 months ago due to corrosion concerns. The maintenance supervisor had delayed that replacement too, using the same cost justification arguments. The valves might not function properly even if Kalen succeeded in opening them. "Leora, the emergency valves haven't been properly maintained," I said quietly, not wanting Kalen to hear this information over the communications channel. "There's no guarantee they'll provide adequate coolant flow even if he gets them open." She stared at me with growing horror. "So he might be dying for nothing?" "Second valve open," Kalen announced, his voice noticeably weaker. "Moving to final valve position." I watched his radiation exposure climb past 13 millirems per hour. At these levels, he was accumulating exposure that would cause severe, possibly fatal radiation poisoning. Even if we could get him to a hospital immediately, his survival chances were diminishing rapidly. The pressure readings reached 2,485 psi. We were approaching structural failure threshold for reactor containment. "Kalen, when you open the final valve, you need to evacuate the basement immediately," I instructed. "Don't wait to verify system operation. Get out of there as fast as possible." "Understood," he replied weakly. I prepared the emergency medical protocols, knowing that Kalen would need immediate evacuation to a facility equipped for radiation poisoning treatment. But with emergency services overwhelmed by coordinated attacks, medical evacuation might not be available. "Third valve is extremely corroded," Kalen reported, his words coming in gasps, "requiring significant force to operate." His radiation exposure reached 15.2 millirems per hour. I was watching a colleague die in real time, sacrificing his life in an attempt to save thousands of strangers he would never meet. "Final valve opening," he announced. On my monitoring systems, I watched emergency coolant pressure begin building in the reactor chamber cooling system. The corroded valves were providing some coolant flow, though not at optimal rates. Emergency cooling is active, I reported to Leora. Partial flow rate, but it's working. Kalen's biometric readings showed critical radiation exposure levels as he began evacuating the basement. His movement was slow, labored, showing the severe effects of radiation poisoning. The pressure readings, which had been climbing relentlessly for hours, finally began to stabilize. Not decreasing yet, but the rate of increase was slowing as emergency coolant reached the reactor core. Kalen, emergency cooling is working, I transmitted. You saved the facility. You saved thousands of lives. His response was barely audible. Good. Get me medical help. As I coordinated emergency medical protocols for Kalen, Leora made one final attempt to contact external authorities. This time, she reached a clear signal. This is Regional Emergency Coordination, the voice responded. We have multiple nuclear facilities under coordinated attack. Emergency medical and hazmat teams are en route to your location. Estimated arrival 23 minutes. I checked the pressure readings. 2,491 psi and holding steady. The emergency cooling had prevented immediate disaster, but reactor containment remained dangerously compromised. We had bought time, not safety. Kalen emerged from the basement access stairway, moving slowly and showing visible signs of severe radiation poisoning. His skin was flushed, his movements uncoordinated, and his dosimeter was clicking continuously. Accumulated exposure, 127 millirems. I read from his monitoring equipment. That's severe radiation poisoning. You need immediate medical treatment. He collapsed into a chair, breathing heavily. Did we stop the meltdown? You stopped the immediate crisis, I replied honestly. But reactor containment is still compromised. We've prevented catastrophic failure, but this facility will never operate again. Through the control room windows, I could see emergency vehicles approaching, hazmat teams, medical units, and what appeared to be federal response vehicles. Help was finally arriving, but as I watched Kalen struggling with the effects of radiation poisoning, as I monitored reactor systems that remained dangerously unstable, as I contemplated the coordinated nature of the attacks, I understood that this crisis was far from over. The immediate disaster had been prevented through terrible sacrifice, but the broader implications, coordinated attacks on multiple nuclear facilities, deliberate sabotage by trusted personnel, and the vulnerability of our entire nuclear infrastructure, represented a threat that would require months or years to fully address. My dosimeter clicked one more time, measuring the radiation that would remain in our environment long after this night ended. The pressure readings held steady at 2,491 psi, just below catastrophic failure, but far above safe operational levels. We had achieved exactly what the emergency framework predicted: bitter survival. The disaster was contained, but the cost was enormous. Kalen would spend months in radiation treatment, possibly never fully recovering. The facility was permanently destroyed. Hundreds of people had been evacuated from their homes, many carrying radiation contamination that would affect their health for years. And somewhere, the maintenance supervisor who had engineered this entire crisis remained free to continue his coordinated attack on other facilities. We had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. The emergency cooling system that had given us hope for exactly 12 minutes suddenly failed with a cascade of alarms that made my blood run cold. Primary emergency cooling offline, I announced, watching the displays with growing horror. Coolant flow has dropped to zero. Kalen's voice crackled through the static from the basement level. The mechanical valves are seizing up. Corrosion is worse than the maintenance records indicated. I can't keep them open. I watched his radiation exposure climb past 18 millirems per hour as he struggled with the failing valves. The brief respite we'd gained was evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. Pressure resuming climb, I reported to Leora. 2,510 psi and rising fast. Rate of increase is now higher than before. The partial cooling created thermal shock that's making the containment more unstable. Leora moved between control stations, coordinating with the approaching emergency teams while monitoring our deteriorating situation. Regional emergency reports hazmat teams are still 14 minutes out. Medical evacuation helicopter is having trouble with the radiation plume affecting their navigation equipment. The facility's structure groaned audibly around us. Through the reinforced control room windows, I could see stress fractures appearing in the concrete walls of the reactor housing. The containment hatch wasn't just warping anymore, it was beginning to buckle visibly. "Kalen, you need to evacuate the basement immediately," I transmitted. "The structural damage is accelerating. That area is going to become uninhabitable in minutes." "Can't leave the valves," he replied, his voice showing clear signs of radiation sickness. "If I stop manually holding them, cooling stops completely." I ran emergency calculations on my terminal. Without continuous coolant flow, reactor core temperature would spike beyond containment capabilities within 30 minutes. But Kalen's current radiation exposure was already at lethal levels. Each additional minute in that environment was reducing his survival chances, even with immediate medical treatment. "Leora, we have a critical decision to make," I said quietly, not wanting Kalen to hear. "If he stays to maintain cooling, he dies within the hour from radiation exposure. If he evacuates, the reactor goes critical and kills thousands." She stared at the pressure readings, now climbing past 2,530 psi. "There has to be another option. Some way to maintain cooling without requiring human presence." I studied every schematic, every backup system, every emergency protocol in our database. The saboteur had been thorough, but focused primarily on electronic and automated systems. The purely mechanical emergency systems were his blind spot, except that years of deferred maintenance had made them unreliable. Then I found something in the facility's original construction blueprints. "There's an emergency flooding system," I announced. "Original 1970s installation, designed to flood the entire reactor chamber with river water in case of complete cooling failure. It's not in our current operational manuals because it was considered obsolete." Leora moved to look over my shoulder at the blueprints. "Why isn't it in current manuals?" "Because activating it means permanently destroying the reactor. The river water carries sediments and minerals that will contaminate the entire reactor core beyond any possibility of cleanup. The facility becomes a permanent environmental hazard site." "But it would stop the meltdown?" "Immediately. Massive water volume would overwhelm the thermal buildup and bring core temperature down to safe levels within minutes." Through my headset, I could hear Kalen's labored breathing as he struggled to maintain the corroded valves. His biometric readings showed severe radiation poisoning symptoms developing rapidly. "Where are the controls for this emergency flooding system?" Leora asked. I traced the blueprints carefully. Manual activation requires two simultaneous actions: opening the main river intake valve from the pump house and releasing the reactor chamber floodgates from the basement-level control station. The implications were immediately clear. We needed someone at the pump house, relatively safe from radiation, and someone in the basement level to operate floodgate controls. Kalen was already in position for basement operations, but barely conscious from radiation exposure. "I'll take the pump house," I announced. "Leora, you coordinate with emergency teams and maintain communications." "Kalen, can you hear me?" His response was weak but audible. "Still here. Getting very sick." "Kalen, there's an emergency flood system that will stop the meltdown immediately, but it requires basement-level activation of floodgate controls. Can you locate Station Charlie in the northeast corner?" "Will look hard to see clearly." I watched his vital signs with growing alarm. Heart rate erratic, blood pressure dropping, temperature spiking, classic symptoms of severe acute radiation syndrome. He had minutes, not hours, before complete incapacitation. The pressure readings reached 2,547 psi. Containment structural failure was imminent. "Leora, how long until emergency teams arrive?" I asked while gathering equipment for the sprint to the pump house. Hazmat teams report 10 minutes. Medical evacuation still having navigation problems from the radiation plume, but they're attempting to land in a contamination-safe zone. I grabbed radiation detection equipment and emergency breathing apparatus. The pump house was outside the immediate radiation zone, but contamination was spreading as reactor containment continued failing. Kalen, I'm heading to pump house control. When I give the signal, you need to open floodgates at Station Charlie. The controls are large red wheel valves. Turn them counterclockwise until they stop. Understood? We'll try. I ran through facility corridors, passing areas where stress fractures were appearing in walls and ceiling panels. The entire structure was responding to the thermal and pressure stresses from the failing reactor containment. Outside, I could see the approaching emergency vehicles, their flashing lights creating a surreal atmosphere in the contaminated twilight. Helicopters circled at a safe distance, unable to approach due to radiation levels that would damage their electronics. The pump house was a separate building connected to the main facility by underground conduits. As I ran across the facility grounds, my portable radiation detector began clicking rapidly. Contamination was spreading beyond the reactor building. Inside the pump house, I found control systems that hadn't been activated in decades. The emergency river intake valve was massive, designed to channel thousands of gallons per minute directly from the adjacent river into the reactor chamber flood system. Kalen, are you at Station Charlie? I called through my portable radio. Found it. Floodgate controls. Very dizzy. Hard to stand. I checked the pump house systems. Emergency power was available. River intake was clear. Massive pumps were in standby mode awaiting activation. Everything was ready except for Kalen's floodgate release. Through the pump house windows, I could see the main reactor building showing visible signs of structural stress. Steam was venting from emergency release points, carrying radiation into the atmosphere. The containment hatch was no longer just warped. It was beginning to separate from its mounting points. Pressure at 2,561 psi. Leora reported over the communications channel. Containment structural failure estimated in less than 15 minutes. I positioned myself at the river intake controls. The activation sequence required precise timing. Floodgates had to open first to prevent pressure buildup that could damage the pumping system. Kalen, on my count, open the floodgates completely. Turn the red wheels counterclockwise until they stop moving. 3, 2, 1, activate. Through the radio, I could hear Kalen struggling with the corroded floodgate controls. These systems hadn't been operated in over 20 years. Corrosion and sediment buildup made them extremely difficult to operate manually. First gate, opening. He reported, his voice barely audible. I waited, watching for his signal that floodgates were open before activating the massive river intake pumps. Premature activation could create hydraulic pressure that would prevent gate operation. Second gate, stuck. Using all my strength, his biometric readings were approaching critical levels. Heart rate over 140, blood pressure dangerously low, radiation exposure now exceeding 25 millirems per hour accumulated over the past 2 hours. He was operating on pure determination while his body was shutting down from radiation poisoning. Gate 2 opening. Gate 3. Almost there. Through the pump house systems, I could monitor water pressure in the floodgate manifold. As Kalen opened each gate, pressure readings changed, indicating successful operation despite the corrosion and mechanical problems. All gates open, he announced. Then I heard him collapse. I immediately activated the emergency river intake system. Massive pumps roared to life, channeling thousands of gallons per minute of river water directly into the reactor chamber. The flooding system was designed to completely submerge the reactor core within 8 minutes. Emergency flooding active, I reported to Leora. River water flowing into reactor chamber at maximum rate. On my pump house monitoring displays, I could see water volume building rapidly in the reactor chamber. The massive influx of cold river water was creating thermal shock that would permanently damage the reactor core. but would also rapidly reduce core temperature below critical levels. Pressure dropping, Leora announced with relief in her voice. 2,543 psi and decreasing rapidly. Core temperature falling below critical threshold. I monitored the flooding operation, ensuring continuous water flow while watching for any system failures. The emergency flooding was working, but at enormous cost. The reactor facility was now permanently contaminated with radioactive river water that would require decades of environmental cleanup. Kalen, emergency flooding is working. You stopped the meltdown. You saved thousands of lives. I transmitted, though I wasn't sure he was still conscious to hear. Leora's voice came over the radio. Hazmat teams are on site. Medical teams are setting up in the decontamination safe zone. They're preparing for immediate evacuation of radiation exposure casualties. I watched the pressure readings continue dropping. 2,487 psi, 2,421 psi, 2,356 psi. The emergency flooding had broken the escalation cycle. We had prevented catastrophic containment failure and potential meltdown. But the victory came at terrible cost. Kalen was unconscious in the basement level from severe radiation poisoning. The reactor facility was permanently destroyed, with radioactive contamination that would take decades to remediate. The emergency flooding had created an environmental disaster that would affect the river system for years. Through the pump house windows, I could see hazmat-suited emergency personnel entering the main facility. Medical teams were preparing treatment equipment for radiation exposure casualties. Federal response teams were establishing command and control operations. I maintained the emergency flooding operation until hazmat teams confirmed that reactor core temperature was stable at safe levels. The immediate crisis was over, but the broader implications were staggering. As I prepared to evacuate the pump house, I realized that we had achieved exactly what the emergency framework predicted: a bitter survival. We had stopped the reactor meltdown and prevented the deaths of thousands, but the personal and environmental costs were enormous. Kalen would require months of intensive medical treatment for severe radiation poisoning, with uncertain survival prospects. The facility was permanently destroyed, representing millions of dollars in lost infrastructure and requiring decades of environmental cleanup. The coordinated nature of the sabotage suggested that other nuclear facilities were experiencing similar crises simultaneously. The pressure readings stabilized at 1,847 psi, well below dangerous levels, but the reactor would never operate again. The emergency flooding had saved lives, but created a permanent environmental hazard that would affect the region for generations. I walked back toward the main facility, where hazmat teams were preparing to evacuate Kalen for immediate medical treatment. Emergency vehicles filled the facility grounds, their flashing lights reflecting off the contaminated buildings. We had won this battle through terrible sacrifice, preventing a nuclear catastrophe that could have killed thousands and contaminated hundreds of square miles. But as I watched the massive emergency response required to contain even our successful resolution, I understood that the broader war against coordinated infrastructure attacks was just beginning. The reactor core pressure had been contained, but the pressure on our entire society was just starting to build. The steady hum of the emergency backup systems suddenly died, leaving us in a silence that made my stomach drop. Every indicator I'd been desperately monitoring showed the same terrifying truth. We had lost our last automated safety net. Final backup cooling system offline, I announced, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay professional. All automated emergency protocols have failed. Through my headset, Kalen's labored breathing filled the static. He'd been in the reactor basement for over an hour now, manually operating corroded valves that should have been replaced years ago. His radiation badge had turned from yellow to deep red 30 minutes ago, a color that meant lethal exposure without immediate medical intervention. Kalen, your exposure levels are critical, I transmitted. You need to evacuate immediately. Can't leave. He gasped between breaths that sounded increasingly wet and painful. Valves keep seizing shut. Have to hold them, or cooling stops completely. I stared at the pressure readings climbing past 2,580 psi. The containment hatch had progressed from warping to actively buckling, metal groaning audibly through the facility's structure. Stress fractures spiderwebbed across the reactor housing walls like cracks in breaking ice. "Leora," I said quietly, knowing Kaylin could hear everything through our open comm channel. "We're out of time and options." She moved beside me at the main control station, her face grave as she studied the cascade of failure indicators. "Medical teams are still 12 minutes out. Even if they could get here instantly, I didn't need her to finish. Kaylin's current radiation exposure meant he was already dying. Each additional minute he stayed to maintain those corroded valves was trading his life for time. Time that might not even matter if we couldn't find another solution." The facility shuddered around us as containment pressure spiked beyond 2,600 psi. Through the reinforced observation windows, I could see the massive containment hatch beginning to separate at its mounting points. The metal was literally being torn apart by forces it was never designed to withstand. That's when I remembered something buried in the facility's original construction blueprints. Documentation I'd studied during my certification but never thought I'd need. "There's an emergency flooding system," I said suddenly, pulling up archived schematics on my terminal. "Original 1970s installation. It's not in our current operational manuals." Leora leaned over to examine the blueprints. "Why was it removed from current documentation?" "Because it's a last resort that destroys everything. The system floods the entire reactor chamber with river water, thousands of gallons per minute. It would stop the meltdown immediately but contaminate the reactor core beyond any possibility of recovery." Through my headset, I heard Kaylin collapse against something metal, his breathing becoming more labored. "Getting very sick," he whispered. "Vision blurring. Hard to stand." I traced the flooding system's activation requirements on the blueprints. The system requires simultaneous activation from 2 locations: opening the main river intake valve from the external pump house and releasing the reactor chamber floodgates from the basement control station. The implications hit us both immediately. We needed someone outside in the pump house, relatively safe from radiation, and someone in the basement level where Kaylin was already dying from exposure. "I'll take the pump house," I announced, grabbing emergency equipment. "Kaylin, can you locate the floodgate controls at Station Charlie?" His response was barely audible. "We'll try. Everything looks fuzzy." The pressure readings hit 2,615 psi. I could hear the containment hatch groaning as its structural integrity approached complete failure. We had minutes, not hours, before catastrophic breach. "Leora, coordinate emergency evacuation of all remaining personnel," I ordered while checking my portable radiation detector. "Once we activate this flooding system, the contamination spread will require a much larger exclusion zone." As I ran through facility corridors toward the external pump house, I could see the physical evidence of our crisis everywhere. Ceiling tiles had fallen from structural vibrations. Emergency lighting flickered erratically. Stress fractures appeared in walls that had stood solid for decades. Outside, the scene looked apocalyptic. Emergency vehicles surrounded the facility at what they considered a safe distance, their flashing lights reflecting off wisps of radioactive steam venting from emergency release points. Helicopters circled overhead, unable to approach due to radiation levels that would damage their electronic systems. The pump house sat separate from the main facility, connected by underground conduits that carried coolant lines and electrical systems. As I ran across the contaminated grounds, my radiation detectors clicking accelerated ominously. The exclusion zone was expanding as reactor containment continued failing. Inside the pump house, I found control systems covered in decades of dust. The emergency river intake valve was massive, a wheel nearly 4 feet in diameter, designed to channel thousands of gallons per minute directly from the adjacent river into the reactor chamber flood system. "Kaylin, are you at Station Charlie?" I called through my portable radio, praying he was still conscious. "Found the controls," he replied, his voice so weak I could barely hear it. "Red wheels? Like you said, very hard to turn. I checked the pump house systems. Emergency power was functional, river intake was clear, and the massive pumps showed ready status. Everything depended on Kalen successfully opening the basement floodgates before his body gave out completely. Through the pump house windows, I watched the main reactor building shake visibly as containment pressure exceeded design limits. The containment hatch wasn't just separating now. I could see daylight through gaps that should never exist. Pressure at 2,634 psi. Leora reported over the communications channel. Containment structural failure imminent. Estimated time to catastrophic breach, 8 minutes. I positioned myself at the river intake controls, hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The activation sequence required perfect timing. Floodgates had to open first to prevent hydraulic pressure that could damage the pumping system. Kalen, listen carefully, I transmitted. On my count, turn all the red wheels counterclockwise until they stop. These controls haven't been used in 20 years, so they'll be corroded and difficult. But you need to get them fully open before I activate the pumps. Understood, he whispered. Then I heard him struggling with the first valve. Through my radio, I could hear him fighting corroded mechanisms that had seized from decades of neglect. These systems had been designed as fail-safes, but time and deferred maintenance had made them nearly inoperable when we needed them most. First gate opening, he reported, followed by sounds of metal grinding against metal. I monitored hydraulic pressure readings in the floodgate manifold, watching for confirmation that each gate was successfully opening. Premature activation of the river intake pumps could create back pressure that would prevent proper gate operation. Second gate stuck. Kalen's voice was failing, each word requiring visible effort. Can't get leverage. His biometric readings, transmitted through his emergency suit, showed heart rate over 150, blood pressure dropping dangerously, body temperature spiking from radiation poisoning. He was operating on determination alone while his body shut down around him. Use your whole body weight, I encouraged. Lean into it. Remember, you're saving thousands of lives. I heard him grunt with effort, followed by the screech of corroded metal finally giving way. Gate 2. Opening. Third gate almost. The pressure readings continued climbing. 2,647 psi. 2,651 psi. Through the pump house windows, I could see the containment hatch beginning to bow outward as internal pressure exceeded the structural limits of the mounting system. All gates open, Kalen announced. Then I heard him collapse completely. I immediately activated the emergency river intake system. Massive pumps roared to life with a sound like jet engines, channeling thousands of gallons per minute of river water through underground conduits directly into the reactor chamber. The flooding system was designed to completely submerge the reactor core within 6 minutes. Emergency flooding active, I reported to Leora. River water flowing into reactor chamber at maximum capacity. On my monitoring displays, I watched water volume build rapidly in the reactor chamber. The massive influx of cold river water was creating thermal shock that would permanently destroy the reactor core, but would also drop core temperature below critical levels within minutes. Pressure beginning to drop, Leora announced with profound relief. 2,643 psi and decreasing. Core temperature falling rapidly. I maintained the flooding operation while monitoring for system failures, knowing that success meant permanent environmental contamination. The emergency flooding would mix radioactive materials with river water, creating contaminated discharge that would affect the river system for decades. Kalen, the flooding is working, I transmitted, though his vital signs suggested he might not be conscious to hear. You did it. You stopped the meltdown. Through the pump house systems, I could track the flooding progress. Water levels in the reactor chamber climbed steadily, while pressure readings continued their blessed decline. 2,598 psi, 2,531 psi, 2,467 psi. The emergency flooding had broken the escalation cycle that would have led to catastrophic containment failure and potential meltdown. We had prevented a nuclear disaster that could have killed thousands and contaminated hundreds of square miles. But our victory carried a terrible price. Kalen lay unconscious in a basement flooded with radioactive water, suffering from radiation exposure that might prove fatal despite immediate medical treatment. The reactor facility was permanently destroyed, requiring decades of environmental cleanup. The coordinated nature of the original sabotage suggested this crisis was part of a larger pattern affecting multiple facilities simultaneously. I watched the pressure reading stabilize at 1,923 psi, well below dangerous levels, but the reactor core was now permanently contaminated slag that would never generate power again. Our successful prevention of catastrophic meltdown had created its own environmental disaster. As hazmat teams finally entered the facility to evacuate Kalen for immediate medical treatment, I realized we had achieved exactly what our situation demanded: bitter survival. We had prevented mass casualties through enormous personal sacrifice, trading one man's health and our facility's future for the lives of thousands. The immediate crisis was contained, but as I watched emergency teams establish what would become a permanent exclusion zone around our facility, I understood that the broader implications were just beginning to unfold. The steady hum of the emergency backup systems suddenly died, leaving us in a silence that made my stomach drop. Every indicator I'd been desperately monitoring showed the same terrifying truth. We had lost our last automated safety net. Final backup cooling system offline, I announced, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay professional. All automated emergency protocols have failed. Through my headset, Kalen's labored breathing filled the static. He'd been in the reactor basement for over an hour now, manually operating corroded valves that should have been replaced years ago. His radiation badge had turned from yellow to deep red 30 minutes ago, a color that meant lethal exposure without immediate medical intervention. "Kalen, your exposure levels are critical," I transmitted. "You need to evacuate immediately. Can't leave." He gasped between breaths that sounded increasingly wet and painful. "Valves keep seizing shut. Have to hold them, or cooling stops completely." I stared at the pressure readings climbing past 2,580 psi. The containment hatch had progressed from warping to actively buckling, metal groaning audibly through the facility's structure. Stress fractures spiderwebbed across the reactor housing walls like cracks in breaking ice. The metallic taste in my mouth had grown stronger, a clear sign my own radiation exposure was accumulating dangerously. Static electricity made my hair stand on end, and the Geiger counter's clicking had accelerated to an almost continuous chatter. "Leora," I said quietly, knowing Kalen could hear everything through our open comm channel, "we're out of time and options." She moved beside me at the main control station, her face grave as she studied the cascade of failure indicators. The control panels flickered intermittently. Some radiation monitors had already failed completely, and steam vents throughout the facility were releasing increasingly radioactive vapor. "Medical teams are still 12 minutes out," she said, her voice tight with the weight of command decisions. Even if they could get here instantly, I didn't need her to finish. Kalen's current radiation exposure meant he was already dying. Each additional minute he stayed to maintain those corroded valves was trading his life for time. Time that might not even matter if we couldn't find another solution. The facility shuddered around us as containment pressure spiked beyond 2,600 psi. Through the reinforced observation windows, I could see the massive containment hatch beginning to separate at its mounting points. The metal was literally being torn apart by forces it was never designed to withstand. That's when clarity cut through the chaos like a blade. Not inspiration, just professional training finally overriding panic. "Emergency flooding system," I said, pulling up archived schematics that I'd memorized during certification. "Manual river intake activation." Leora leaned over to examine the blueprints on my terminal. "The system that was decommissioned?" "Not decommissioned, just removed from operational protocols because it destroys everything. My fingers traced the control pathways. Thousands of gallons per minute of river water directly into the reactor chamber. It stops meltdown immediately but contaminates the core beyond recovery. Through my headset, I heard Kalen collapse against something metal, his breathing becoming more labored. "Getting very sick," he whispered. "Vision blurring. Can't feel my hands." I studied the activation requirements. 2-point manual activation, river intake valve at the external pump house, and reactor chamber floodgates from basement station Charlie. The implications were brutally simple. Someone had to reach the pump house, dangerous but survivable. Someone else had to operate floodgate controls from the basement where Kalen was already dying from radiation exposure. "I'll take the pump house," I announced, checking my portable radiation detector. "Kalen, can you locate the floodgate controls at Station Charlie?" "Red will valves, 3 of them." His response was barely audible. "Will, look for them." The pressure readings hit 2,615 psi. The containment hatch groaned as metal stress approached complete structural failure. Minutes, not hours, before catastrophic breach. "Leora, evacuate all remaining personnel immediately," I ordered while grabbing emergency equipment. "Once we flood the reactor chamber, contamination spread will be massive." As I ran through facility corridors toward the external pump house, the physical evidence of our crisis surrounded me. Ceiling tiles had fallen from structural vibrations. Emergency lighting flickered erratically from electrical system damage. Fresh cracks appeared in walls that had stood solid for decades. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the facility at maximum safe distance, their flashing lights reflecting off radioactive steam venting from emergency release points. The air itself felt charged, heavy with invisible death that my radiation detector measured in increasingly rapid clicks. The pump house sat separate from the main facility, connected by underground conduits. As I crossed the contaminated grounds, my detector's clicking accelerated ominously. The exclusion zone was expanding as reactor containment continued failing. Inside the pump house, I found control systems covered in years of dust and neglect. The emergency river intake valve was massive, a wheel nearly 4 feet in diameter, designed to channel thousands of gallons per minute directly from the adjacent river into the reactor chamber. "Kalen, are you at Station Charlie?" I called through my portable radio. "Found the controls," he replied, his voice so weak I could barely distinguish words. "3 red wheels, like you said, very heavy." I checked pump house systems. Emergency power functional, river intake clear, massive pumps showing ready status. Everything depended on Kalen successfully opening those floodgates before his body gave out completely. Through the pump house windows, I watched the main reactor building shake visibly as containment pressure exceeded all design limits. The containment hatch wasn't just separating. I could see actual gaps where massive bolts were shearing under pressure. "Pressure at 2,634 psi. Leora reported over communications. "Containment structural failure imminent. 8 minutes maximum." I positioned myself at the river intake controls, hands steady despite everything. Perfect timing was critical. Floodgates had to open first to prevent hydraulic back pressure that could damage the pumping system. "Kalen, listen carefully," I transmitted. "On my count, turn all 3 red wheels counterclockwise until they stop completely. They'll be corroded and stuck, but you need them fully open before I activate the pumps." "Understand," he whispered. Then I heard him struggling with corroded metal. Through my radio, I could hear him fighting mechanisms that had seized from decades of neglect. Every grunt of effort, every scrape of metal against metal, every labored breath broadcast his deteriorating condition. "First gate opening," he reported, followed by the grinding sound of corroded metal finally yielding. I monitored hydraulic pressure in the floodgate manifold, watching for confirmation that each valve was opening properly. Premature pump activation could create back pressure that would prevent the gates from operating. "Second gate, stuck solid." His voice was failing, each word requiring enormous effort. "Can't get can't get leverage. His biometric readings showed heart rate over 150, blood pressure dropping, body temperature spiking from advanced radiation poisoning. He was operating on willpower alone while his body shut down around him. Use your whole body weight, I encouraged. Lean into it with everything you have. I heard him grunt with effort, followed by the screech of metal finally giving way. Gate 2, opening, third ones. Almost. Pressure continued climbing. 2,647 psi. 2,651 psi. Through the pump house windows, the containment hatch was visibly bowing outward as internal forces exceeded every structural limit. All gates open, Kalen announced. Then I heard him collapse completely. I immediately activated the emergency river intake system. Massive pumps roared to life with a sound like aircraft engines, channeling thousands of gallons per minute through underground conduits directly into the reactor chamber. The system was designed to completely submerge the reactor core within 6 minutes. Emergency flooding active, I reported to Leora. Maximum flow rate achieved. On my monitoring displays, water volume built rapidly in the reactor chamber. The massive influx of cold river water created thermal shock that would permanently destroy the reactor core, but would also drop core temperature below critical levels within minutes. Pressure beginning to drop, Leora announced with profound relief in her voice. 2,643 psi and decreasing steadily. Core temperature falling rapidly. I maintained flooding operations while monitoring for system failures, knowing that success meant creating our own environmental disaster. The emergency water would mix radioactive materials with river discharge, contaminating the waterway for decades. Kalen, the flooding is working, I transmitted, though his vital signs suggested he might already be unconscious. You did it. You stopped the meltdown. Through the pump house systems, I tracked flooding progress. Water levels climbed steadily in the reactor chamber while pressure readings continued their blessed decline. 2,598 psi, 2,531 psi, 2,467 psi. The emergency flooding had broken the escalation cycle that would have led to catastrophic containment failure. We had prevented a nuclear disaster that could have killed thousands and contaminated hundreds of square miles. But victory carried a terrible price. Kalen lay unconscious in a basement flooded with radioactive water, suffering from exposure that might prove fatal despite immediate medical treatment. The reactor facility was permanently destroyed, requiring decades of environmental cleanup. And somewhere, the people who had sabotaged our safety systems were still free to strike again. I watched pressure readings stabilize at 1,923 psi, well below dangerous levels. The reactor core was now permanently contaminated slag that would never generate power again. Our successful prevention of catastrophic meltdown had created its own long-term contamination problem. As hazmat teams finally entered to evacuate Kalen for emergency medical treatment, I realized we had achieved exactly what our situation demanded: survival. We had prevented mass casualties through enormous personal sacrifice, trading one man's health and our facility's future for thousands of lives. The immediate crisis was contained, but as I watched emergency teams establish what would become a permanent exclusion zone around our facility, I understood that our victory, such as it was, had only delayed a larger threat. The coordinated nature of the sabotage, the sophisticated override of safety systems, the timing of the maintenance failures, none of it was accidental. This attack on our facility was just one piece of a much larger operation targeting critical infrastructure. I stood in the pump house, listening to the steady flow of contaminated water, knowing we had won this battle by sacrificing everything we were supposed to protect. The metallic taste in my mouth reminded me that I, too, would carry the consequences of this day for whatever time I had left. But we were alive. The town was safe. And sometimes, in a world where people deliberately target nuclear facilities for destruction, survival is the best victory you can hope to achieve.